Good morning, everybody. Tim Andersen here, the Appraiser's Advocate. We're glad you're with us this morning. Thank you for taking the time to sit down. We've got a special guest, a good friend, a personal friend, someone who's with us a lot. Craig is a mover and shaker in the real estate appraisal business. Of course, I'm speaking of Craig Morley. Craig, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Tim. How are you doing?
I'm doing just great, Craig. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started, of course, we have to get a couple of things out of the way. Now, Craig sits on about 8 million boards and consults with about 17 million different people. So we have to understand that Craig is not here as a member of the ASB. He's not here as a member, as a spokesman for NAR. He's not here with anything to do with the National Association of Appraisers. And he's not here with anything to do with the state of Utah. He's just here because he's Craig and he's got a lot of interesting stuff to say. And given his national connections, he knows a whole lot and is willing to share it with us. Now, Craig, in light of that, let's go ahead and get started. Now, Fannie Mae has some very specific Q and C ratings. And we appraisers look at that and we go, Fannie Mae, that's just absolutely lovely. And you can have your definitions of them. But what happens when in reality something is not a Q3 or a Q4 or a C3 or a C4, but it's somewhere in between? Now, builders don't build the Fannie Mae quality and condition ratings. They build for the market. They build what the market wants. They build what the market can afford. So as appraisers are looking at what builders have built and what owners have done over time to the property, how do we justify it when we look at something and something is obviously has a 3.5 Q or C rating? Are we are we violating anything to do with Usepap, or are we upsetting Fannie Mae's algorithms if we go in and qualify something as a Q 3.5?
Well, as I truly wished we had the ability to go in and dial in a little tighter on some of that. The only problem that I think anybody who tries to go in and uh, divide that to meet make it a different rating than what they have is that you get errors and it won't upload into the portals. And so the ability to go and say, well, this is kind of between a good and an average, so I want to find a halfway mark and put it that way is just not practical or possible within the UAD reporting guidelines. You'll get an error and it won't upload. So the challenge that we run into is, first of all, is how do I determine at what point does a property go from average to good quality or go from average condition to good condition? And when I find these properties that kind of fall between the lines, it's well, it's probably better than average, but I don't know, it's not quite good. How do I accurately communicate that to my client and reflect that in the analysis that I perform? And over time, as Fannie had rolled out these rating guidelines, I think most of us, I know you and I both, Tim, were raised in an era where everything was a relative comparison. We didn't care if it was average or good. We just wanted to know the relative difference between the properties because that then became the basis that we would use in making that comparison. And when Fannie comes in and or the GSEs come in and say, well, a house is either good or it's average, and it's always good or average. And it's taken a little bit of adjustment in the way that we think of things because the reality is the analysis is still a relative comparison between them, but the rating of the property is not. And so it's really a challenge to go in and find a way to quantify and support those ratings. I think, Tim, you probably would, as we've talked, I think you've mentioned that you've seen more people getting turned in to their state boards now than ever before. Is that pretty much your observation?
Craig, unfortunately, yes, it is.
And see, one of the things that people I think sometimes don't realize is that under the current guideline, under the current statutes, if an appraiser gets turned in, everything in that appraisal is fair game. Usually, the appraisal is getting turned in by a consumer who's unhappy with the result, a seller or an agent or someone. And once that appraisal is turned into the regulatory board, they look at everything. And frankly, they don't care about the value. What they're looking at is the process. Did they follow standard one in developing the appropriate analysis and doing all the elements that are outlined in Usepap? And did they communicate those things properly in accordance with standard two? And oftentimes, I talk to appraisers all the time and say, well, I've got a good number. This is the right number. And unfortunately, the board doesn't care. They don't care. They just want to make sure that you did your job in terms of developing and reporting your results properly. And one of the areas that I see the possible area of deficiency is, how do I quantify a quality and condition rating? And my experience is, I've seen people who have been told at some of the continuing education classes, well, we just rate everything the same. That way I don't have to worry about how I rated it last time. If I rate everything as average quality, average condition, then I never have to worry about having misrated it someplace else. And I observe in some of the appraisals that I see where you will have a home in a beautiful gated development where the costs are several, $300 or $400 a square foot, and you've got an average quality rating, and you've got oftentimes an average condition rating for a house that's 1 or 2 years old. And so I think it would be interesting to talk about how do we find a way to quantify that rating so that if someone is unhappy with the results, that doesn't become a problem for us as we go in and try to develop to defend our appraisal.
Okay, so how do we quantify it, Craig?
You know what?
We're in a really expensive neighborhood, and security guards and gates, and there are no houses in there less than $1 million. And we say, oh, well, everything's average. Well, aren't we saying that the subject is average relative to every other house in the neighborhood? Or are we saying the house is average based on Fannie Mae's definition of that, which has absolutely nothing to do with every house in the neighborhood? That appears to be a dilemma. What is it we're supposed to do? How do we overcome that?
Well, if we're looking at a relative rating, average may be appropriate, but the GSEs are not asking for a relative rating. They're asking for an absolute rating. And so what they're saying is that if this is a good quality or a very good quality home, it's always a good or very good quality home. And it's interesting as you read the definition for the various quality classes, it falls remarkably in line with Fannie Mae, or excuse me, with Marshall Swift's average, good, very good quality ratings. And so for me, the thing that I've determined to do is use that cost guideline as a way to support my quality rating. For example, if I've got a home in a production development, and it's not uncommon in some of the areas where I'm dealing with, where they'll have a base model home at $495, and they spend over $100,000 on maybe a 2,400 square foot home in upgraded features. It all of a sudden you have to start asking yourself, does that mean that the quality rating should be higher than the base model rating of whatever I think is appropriate for that? And my personal belief is yes, it does. And in fact, I think using these various cost sources as a guideline to help me determine what the quality class is a defensible, supportable, generally accepted practice where I can go in and say, my national cost source says that a home of this type is, I've got to use my good quality or my very good quality cost data to match up with where the builder's at on their costs, and assuming that there's no funny business going on with the builder and inflating things, that at least at that point, if I'm going before my board, I can go in and say, I rated this as a very good quality home. The base model home is not a square box. It's got 10-foot ceilings and all of the different things. These folks spent another $30 a square foot from that base model home, which, by the way, from a good quality to a very good quality rating in Marshall Swift is somewhere in that same range. And so I think that if I have compared the cost data from the national source based on these different definitions and quality classes, that is a quantifiable source that I can point to, and it gives me a way to define how I develop that quality rating. Now, I'll be honest with you, the challenge I run into is when it falls in between. It's probably better than average, but not quite good. And the question is what do I do with it then? Do I just rate it as average or good, or how do I do it? And one of the things that we've found that seem to work good is on the bottom end of that Fannie Mae form, there's a couple of blank lines. And we've determined that some of those, we label one of them as upgrades and features. You know, where someone has got an average quality home, it's in an average quality, you know, the neighborhood is pretty much average quality homes of comparable size and features, but they've upgraded. It's got a tile roof instead of an asphalt shingle, or it's got granite instead of laminate, or they've done an extraordinary job on some of the interior decor. It's not good quality, but it's better than the run-of-the-mill average home. We'll normally go in and deal with it there as an upgraded feature. And then what I try to do is use my cost source as a basis to support that adjustment. I'll go in and look and say, well, Marshall Swift says that going from a tile floor to, or from a carpet vinyl floor to a tile or wood floor is about a differential of $3 or $4 a square foot. I can do that. Now, is that what the market's doing? I don't know. I think, you know, I'd have to look at my market data to make that determination. If I put everything in my grid and I see no difference between the comparable sales that have these features and the ones that don't, then I can conclude that, you know, maybe that feature just doesn't matter that much. But I think one of the things we sometimes fail to do is look at the results at the bottom line and say, well, I've got a really tight range or I don't. And if I don't, maybe there's a characteristic with that comparable sale that I haven't accurately reflected in my analysis. And maybe I need to take a few minutes and try to figure out what that is. Did I adjust enough for the garage? Did I adjust enough for the pool? Is my lot size adjustment appropriate, or view? Because there's something going on with that property that somebody paid more for it, and I'm trying to determine what that is. Now, sometimes it's just error in the market. Sometimes you get somebody who just overpays for a property, and I think most appraisers in the current environment would say almost every home is being overpaid. You know, at least it seems that way relative to what we're used to. But I think the idea of, in your mind, coming up and doing the analysis that says there's got to be some reason why these things are doing what they're doing. And I want my analysis to try to reflect that. And then I want to try to communicate that in my appraisal report. And so if I am making an adjustment for view or for location or for quality or condition, I want to go into my comments in my supporting analysis and explain this is why I did it the way I did it. And it takes a little more work, but I think in the long run, you're far more likely to avoid problems if someone questions the appraisal result. You were
microphone on.
okay.
There's some background noise. Craig, let's go back a minute. You were mentioning that some appraisers are taught just mark everything average. That way, there's no controversy. And let's face it, you go into a house of $1 million homes, and $1 million home is average. Okay, so you click average. Now, Fannie Mae is doing an audit of its records, and it pulls up an appraisal you did in that $1 million neighborhood, and you've marked average. Whereas every other appraisal they have going back a year in that same neighborhood, indeed, sometimes on the same streets, indicate good to very good quality. So Fannie Mae writes you that letter and says, dear appraiser, what makes you so smart? You said everything was average. Your peers are not agreeing with you. They're saying everything is good to very good. So now you're on Fannie's radar, which is not the radar you really want to be on. So what do you do? How do you respond to Fannie Mae? How do you defend yourself in a case like that? If indeed you even can defend yourself, what do you do, Craig?
Well, the thing that's interesting with these little notes that you get from Fannie Mae is that they say your rating is materially different than your peers. They don't tell you what your peers did. They're just telling you that you're different than what they did, which makes it interesting because you're going in and looking at some of these things and saying, well, how what did they do? What did they rate it? How do I know what my peers did? That there are a few tools out there, and if you're involved in some of these data share applications, you might be able to look at some of these and say, well, I got half of them who rated it average and half of them who rated it good. I don't know that that's the best way to go about it. I think realistically is as we are familiar with what those definitions are, and as we have a method, a system, a quantifiable way to go in and say, this rating best fits this property, and you are able to go in and provide that support, that's really what they're looking for. Uh, is the rating that you provided consistent with the definitions that they've outlined within the UAD standard? And I think the idea that if I'm wrong, and I think I don't know about you, but I'm loath to make a change on an appraisal when somebody comes in and says, "Hey, you made a mistake, or we think you made a mistake. We want you to look at it." I think most of us are reluctant to make a change, but the reality is that if I've made a mistake, fix it. You're far better off to go, rather than dig your heels in and say, no, I called it this and I am not going to change it, is a formula to cause you problems down the road. I think the thing that you have to do is be clear in the addendum or somewhere in your report that you go in and say, listen, I had submitted this appraisal on this date. It came to my attention that there was something that I was either unaware of or that has caused me to change my conclusions on the quality or the condition rating. And because of this, I've done this. I believe that it best represents this quality or condition or location or view rating. And I've altered the appraisal to reflect that. And this report has been updated and make sure it's clear what you did, when you did it, and why you did it, so that you don't run into a problem with it having the appearance of undue influence where somebody's coming in trying to manipulate the results. It needs to be factual and accurate, but let's face it, we all make mistakes. And so if you've made a mistake, fix it.
It's awful to be human, isn't it, Craig?
That's terrible.
Okay. I want to move on to the concept of adjustments, but before we do, I want to back up a little bit. This concept of marking everything average to potentially to avoid controversy. Now, Usepap's definition of misleading, and I'm not going to quote it, but basically it says intentionally or unintentionally withholding pertinent facts. Now, you mark everything, excuse me, the appraiser marks everything average. Okay. Is it possible that a state appraisal board could get a hold of that appraisal, see that everything is average in this $1 million plus neighborhood, and conclude that given everything's average, which we know it isn't, that the appraiser is trying to withhold pertinent data, thus is guilty of violating Usepap?
Well, as you well know, I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't matter what USPAP says. It only matters what your appraisal board thinks USPAP says. And my experience has been is that sometimes appraisal board members tend to be hypercritical of some of the work that's done, especially if they don't like it. And so the reality is that I think that anytime you are mischaracterizing a feature or characteristic or adjustment that should be made that's not, or trying to be very bland or generic in the way that we're doing things, we're setting ourselves up for a possible uh, mis conclusion that we were misleading. And so my advice is always be as descriptive, as accurate as you possibly can. And I think it's important that as we make adjustments, we have this idea that I got to pair every sale, and certainly that is what the GSEs would like you to do. But if you're going to make an adjustment, make sure you've got an explanation for how you did it, why you did it, and that it pretty much mirrors what the market's actually doing. It may be chatting with a couple of brokers and saying, listen, I've got this characteristic. How do your buyers react to this kind of a thing? Make a notation of it and keep it for reference, because oftentimes it's very difficult in the morass of all the data that we find ourselves trying to deal with to extract out what is somebody actually paying for some characteristics. So there's lots of different ways to do that.
Okay, Craig, we're going to circle back to state appraisal boards in a few minutes, but let's go to adjustments. We've been talking about Q and C ratings. So I have two questions of you. Please, how do you adjust for Q and C ratings when they're obviously so subjective? And number two, and this is related only tangentially, what is the difference between location, site, and view?
So let's talk a little bit about the adjustments for your quality and condition ratings. I think most of the time, if you line up your data, you're going to find that there are people will pay more for a good quality home than they will for an average quality home. They will pay more for a home that's been remodeled as compared to one that hasn't been. And so ultimately, the thing that I like to try to do is periodically go in and take pools of data so that I can perform analysis. I don't want to do it on every single assignment, but I do want to do it frequently enough that I can go in and say, okay, if I've got a 20-year-old home that has not had any material remodeling or updating, I want to get some of those kinds of sales and 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 keep them in a bucket of data. And then I want to get some of these homes that have had, they've gone in and done some of the cosmetic updates. And let's kind of look and see how is the price different from these properties that don't have any material improvements. And then I want to get another bucket of data of homes where they've completely gone in and changed out the cabinets and the counters and the appliances and fixtures, and see how much different that makes. Now, oftentimes we can find in some of the markets I deal with, we'll find a 20-year-old home that has been sold. The people have gone in and completely remodeled it, and it ends up selling for a lot more money. I want to hang on to that data because what it tells me is I've got somebody who bought an older house. They paid $300,000. They've gone in and completely remodeled it and sold it for $400,000. Now, in the current environment, I may have a market condition factor that I have to consider in there. But what I can do is go in and look at that and say, well, that home sold for $25 a square foot more because of apparently because of the remodeling that they did. I can do the same thing with homes that have been updated. Somebody buys a home, they go do some cosmetic updates, and it sells for more, but not as much as the home that's been completely renovated. And if I do that enough times, I can establish a pattern or a trend that says, you know, a home that's been updated will sell for $10 to $15 a square foot more than a home that hasn't been. I've got a home that's been completely remodeled and it's selling for $25 to $30 a square foot more versus one that hasn't been. And if I find a place on my computer where I kind of go drop that data and kind of hang on to it as part of a master adjustment file, when I am then going in and performing my analysis, I can go in and look at these. Now I know that I have a grade from 0 to $30, $40 a square foot for differences in updating and quality and things like that. And now I've got to apply my judgment between the subject and the comparable sales and say, well, within this spectrum of data that I've analyzed, I think it falls a little bit more on the lower end of the updating because they updated it, but not really well. So it's clear that this property is bringing a little more than the homes that haven't been had anything done, but a $10 or $12 a square foot adjustment seems to make sense. And so I can apply that. And so we can certainly go through and do the different methods, regression, and some of these things are good too, but it's a little more challenging to quantify quality and condition within a regression model. I have to create dummy variables and try to see if I can create a way to go measure that. And you can, but I think in terms of doing something that's relatively simple, doesn't take too long. You don't have to have special programs or analytical skills to be able to go in and find these data points and put them in these buckets and perform the analysis and look and say, well, we're seeing this range based on the market reaction to these things. And for me, that's a pretty easy way to go in. And if I ever get called before a board or if I'm in court and I need to explain to a jury what I did, most people can pretty well understand that. It's easy to explain. One of the things that I routinely see is people will say, well, I'm in a golf course neighborhood, or I'm in a gated neighborhood, or I'm in, and so the question is, well, what makes it beneficial versus neutral versus adverse? Oftentimes I'll see people saying, well, I've got a house that backs a busy street. Is that a neighborhood characteristic or is it a site characteristic? I'm in a golf course neighborhood, development. Is that a neighborhood characteristic or is it a site characteristic or is it both? And how do I, number one, support any kind of an adjustment? And what is the difference between a neighborhood characteristic and a site characteristic? And I think, as you had mentioned, Tim, one of the challenges that we find is that, I'm located on a golf course. Is it the location on the golf course that gives me an advantage, if there is an advantage or not? And or is it the view looking across the golf course, or is it because I'm right in the middle of the fairway and I'm getting about 10 holes in my stucco every day from crappy golfers, an adverse characteristic? And so we kind of have to go in, and in our minds we've got to go in and determine what is the difference between a neighborhood characteristic, how do I support that, and what is the difference between a site view characteristic and how do I support that? And I think one of the ways that I like to do or use is to look at neighborhood. So if I've got a neighborhood that it has a golf course associated or a public park or some amenity, and I've got a neighborhood in the same general market area that doesn't have that characteristic, now I'm going to probably filter out properties that back right onto the golf course. But if I have these properties that are not on the golf course, and I've got some that don't have a golf course associated with it, and if I discover there's no material difference in the average price of these similar homes, then I can reasonably conclude the golf course only has an influence for the properties that back onto it, but the other properties it really doesn't have an influence on. Now, I see neighborhoods where the golf course does influence the neighborhood, and others where they really don't. And so I live in a neighborhood that has a public golf course, and if I back onto the golf course, people will pay a premium. But if I don't back onto the golf course, there's no difference between that and an area that has no golf course with it. And so I think as we look at making these ratings, if we need to look at it from the standpoint of overall predominant values, the neighborhood characteristics, and is the influence of this amenity or characteristic influencing the properties in the entire neighborhood? Does it affect the entire area, or does it only affect those properties that have that characteristic next to it? And so if I oftentimes will see people rate something, well, this is on a busy street. And so the neighborhood rating is it's a busy street. In our area, I'm seeing people going in and putting that this is a neutral residential mountain neighborhood. Well, guess what? We live in the desert. I mean, you can see the mountains in the background, but the reality is I question, well, how is this a mountain neighborhood when I'm in the desert? And what kind of influence does that have on my neighborhood if I can't, if I'm just on a flat subdivision where I have no elevations, it just doesn't make sense to me. And so I think we have to, in our minds, clearly delineate what's a neighborhood feature and what's a site feature, and does it make any difference? We've done over the years, we've done hundreds of subdivisions for development loans. And one of the things that we will do is go in and develop a baseline. So we'll come in and say, okay, a typical lot is this size, and it has a neutral typical view, and this is the value of that lot. And so, if that lot's $100,000 as my baseline, then we will go in and look at lot transactional data that says lots with a partial view get a view premium of X%. And if I have, and what we've done is we've kind of broken it down in our area. 4 or 5 categories seem to work. So if I back onto open space and I've got an element of privacy, our market says that that's a 5 to 10% premium. So I can go in, if I make an adjustment for something that has a little better than typical privacy, that's a $5 to $10,000 adjustment that I can support from data for that view characteristic. If I'm on an elevated lot that kind of looks over the rooftops and gives me a view of the valley or something like that, our data says that's somewhere between 10 and 25%. And so we kind of break them into these categories. If I'm up on an elevated view with an unobstructed view of an amenity that is very desirable, we will see in our market lots that will go for double, sometimes more than a base lot price. We get into a few of these areas where you've got some beautiful red rock natural features looking into a place like Snow Canyon State Park, and it's spectacular. And I've got water features and golf courses and red rocks in the background, and oftentimes those will go for 150% of a base lot. So you have to take your data, you analyze it, and then come up with some kind of a method. Now, ideally, I want to find comparable sales that have similar characteristics, but in the real world, that doesn't happen all the time. So that's a way that we found that is supportable. If I'm sitting in front of a jury and having to try to explain why I did what I did, I can do that. I can show sales that demonstrate that, and I keep that in my work file. I keep it in my master work file, and I can refer back to it as I need to try to explain. And then in my analysis, I will do an abbreviated description of how I develop those adjustments. And let's face it, view and location and some of these are sometimes hard to quantify, but there are ways to do it. And I think if we take a few minutes and think through the process, we can come up with methods that will work for us.
you were talking about buckets of data, and then you just mentioned a master work file. Relative to those two entities, is that what USPAP means when it says you've got to have all your data in your work file or the ability to reference data?
Yes, that's the way I see it. In fact, one of the things I was doing a narrative report on a property that was very complex, had all kinds of different elements to it. And I had done appraisals of these properties that had some of these elements that I wanted to refer to. So what I did to supplement my work file was to go in and make a copied a link to the work files and put them in my electronic files. So I've got one that's got some ag land over here. I've got one that's got some water rights over here. I've got one that's got some irrigated farmland over here that I had appraised, that I am using some of that data. And so now when I open that up, I see all these links that go back to these different files that contain some information that I've relied on in developing my analysis. And I think we can do the same thing in with the master work file. Is you can go create a little link that says, yeah, here's I've done this analysis. I've got the data here. I've got a link that I put here so I can remember where it's at, and then I've got a way to refer back to it if I need to provide the source for that master data.
So you don't necessarily uh, copy the master data information into the work file. What you do is in the work file, you put a link to the master data file, and there you can access it that way. Is that correct?
That's the way I do it. Of course, you could put a copy in there; it's not a problem, but it does tend to take up a lot more storage, and so we try not
Let's
to do that if we can help it.
okay. Let's get to something that's dear to your heart. State appraisal boards. Now, you were on the state. You were on the Utah State Appraisal Board for 8 years, if I recall correctly. Your son Jeff currently chairs the board, so you're familiar with it, and you occasionally continue to consult with the board. So let's talk about appraisal boards. Now, obviously, in the states with which I'm familiar, who gets on the appraisal board is a function of the governor. They're appointed by the governor. They serve at the governor's pleasure, so on and so forth. So, you sit through some meetings, and uh, you wonder if some of these appraisal board members bothered to pay attention in school. But they're human, so you just have to put up with that. So, is there anything we as boots on the ground appraisers can do to get a hold of the governor and say, "Hey, governor, let's put somebody on the state appraisal board who has a clue, please? Could we do that?" What do we as appraisers need to do to influence the governor?
Well, there's several things I think that we can do. Number one is join a coalition. If you don't have a state coalition, get with NAA, National Association of Appraisers, and have them help you set one up. We have far more influence as a collective voice than we do as a lone voice in trying to influence some of these kinds of things. And as an appraisal board, or excuse me, as an appraisal coalition, it becomes really important to find those people, first of all, who know USPAP. They're fair-minded, they're objective. The thing that probably drives me the most crazy is appraisal board members who feel like that if you don't do it the way I do it, it's wrong. And there is a lot of that happens. In fact, Arizona no longer has an appraisal board. It's been rolled into the Department of Financial Institutions, and they have essentially paid employees and bureaucrats that administer that. And part of the reason why is they were having so much difficulty with the board. In fact, I've got a friend who was called in before the board, and they were so deep into the weeds on some of the, well, how, these different methods of developing adjustments that they didn't like that he had used a Ratterman method for adjusting square footage rather than the way they did it. And they ultimately, he prevailed and got the complaint dismissed. But the reality is that and I've mentioned this before, the appraisal board is the board that determines whether or not you complied with Usepap. And far too frequently, we have board members who don't know Usepap. And so they don't understand that there's more than one definition of market value. And you don't even have to appraise the market value. You can appraise all kinds of liquidation value or investment value or all kinds of things. And so we have to make sure that if we get people appointed to that board, that they are fair-minded people. They've got enough experience that they are going to understand the various processes and not run into problems with administering discipline to appraisers when perhaps it shouldn't be administered. And we see that happen from time to time. And so as we look at determining what can we do to influence that, find out how those names are being submitted to the governor, because I'm pretty sure most governors don't have a tight relationship with the appraisers in the state. They're relying on those recommendations coming from some other source. Usually it's the governing body that oversees the appraiser licensees. In our state, in Utah, I'm in 3 different states, but in the state of Utah, the division director, it has responsibilities over real estate licenses, over mortgage, over AMCs, and over appraisers. And we just had a change, and this I think is due in part to some of the problems that came out of Louisiana with their board, where they had allegations of restraint of trade. So when I first went on the board, it was a 7-member board, and we had someone from the mortgage industry, somebody from the real estate industry. We had an AG that sat on there, and the rest were appraisers. They simplified that down to a 5-member board where there were 4 appraisers and 1 public member who was a real estate agent. We've recently changed that to this last legislative session. It was changed back to a 7-member board where 1 member of an appraisal management company will now sit on the board, and back again to having 1 member of a mortgage company will be sitting on the board. And then you've got your 4 appraisers. Well, it's always a concern to me is how is a real estate agent, a mortgage guy, and an AMC going to be able to administer appropriate discipline to appraisers using Usepap as the basic standard for measuring that if they really don't know it or understand it. And if I've got somebody who's got an axe to grind, a mortgage guy who's really upset with appraisers who keep killing their deals, that might not be very pleasant for appraisers who kill these deals. And so what we've done is the weird thing for me is that in our state, in the state of Utah, the Utah Association of Appraisers has an unbelievable lobby effort. Chris Kyler and Mike Ostermiller are the 2 lobbyists. They're both executives with the realtor boards, and they have an unbelievable relationship with with virtually every legislator in the state. And so what we've done is I've joined the legislative committee with the realtors. We see every single bill that comes before the state and give it a thumbs up, thumbs down, or neutral. And so I'm involved in the process. Plus, I've got a relationship with the division director. So for us, if we've got something coming up, I will get a call from the division director, and he'll say, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking. What do you think? And part of the reason why they're calling me is because of my past relationship. Part of it is that I'm work with the Utah Association of Appraisers, which is a conglomeration of appraisal organizations. And we hire lobbyists. In fact, we hire the realtor lobbyists to represent our interests because more often than not, they come into alignment. And it allows us to have significant influence on who gets appointed to those boards. And so as we are now looking to put an AMC member and a mortgage member, uh, we've been able to supply those names of people that we know, we think are fair-minded and think will do be objective and do a good job. And those names are now going to the division director who will submit them to the governor. Now, the governor has the option to throw them out and say, no, I got a buddy I want put on there, and that could happen. But at least we have been able to influence that in some degree, and we're far more likely to get people on the board that are going to represent the best interest of the appraisal profession as a whole. And I think that anytime we can get these groups to participate in that process, it's going to be better for the appraisers who are regulated by that regulating entity.
Craig, thank you. As we wrap up, is there anything else on your mind? Anything else floats your boat?
Hey, it's just that everybody ought to be aware. There's the Appraisal Foundation through the ASB has put out some a request for public comments on some of these things. If you've got ideas that you want to see on some of these things, comment. Every single comment is read and considered, and be respectful when you do it. But
Yeah, they are public records, so they probably ought to be presentable in a family situation.
if you start calling people names and stuff like that, it probably doesn't go quite as well. But the reality is they are all looked at and considered based on their merits. And I think the reality is that there's some real interesting challenges that we face that you can weigh in on and give your 2 cents and see if we ultimately, you want to see the very best documents possible that represent the interests of the profession in the best possible way. And the more people who participate in the process, the better those things look like.
Greg, thank you. I appreciate it. As always, it's great to be with you. Just so full disclosure, Craig and I are personal friends. We've known each other for many years. And Craig, as always, my best to your family. And I look forward to the next time we chat. So, folks, again, thanks for listening in. We appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to sit down with us. On behalf of Craig Morley, this is Tim Andersen, the Appraiser's Advocate, and we are clear.